So with a lot of oil paintings, we want to start with the darks first and keep them very thin and fluid. And so I'm going to block it in, basically still using more of the violet tones, maybe go with a little more red tone. So just start to block in the major shapes with a little more pigment than I've been using. So let's go ahead and start. I'm going to mix up a bit of ultramarine blue with alizarin crimson. I'm going to dip into the turpentine. Make that nice and red. Okay. Now I'm going to go back to the idea of that diagonal line that we talked about. Nice diagonal line that essentially divides the canvas into two pictorial spaces. The foreground being larger and the area above this line, background, being slightly smaller. Here's my axis line, which creates the area that I want the center of interest to fall in. Now just using nice brushwork to start indicating the textures of the landscape. I'll block in using this approach. I'm building the drawing in this way, but staying very, very light to the touch, very thin with the pigment, so I can continue to build layers over this. And we'll just follow this process through. It's just a matter of taking the paint and gradually building up to the idea closer to that black and white design. In this case, I'm using, instead of black paint, I'm using a nice reddish violet tone. And also gives me another opportunity to address those shapes, the all-important variety of shapes. It's also a good opportunity to have fun with the brush. You want some of the brush marks to emulate the textures of the natural terrain. So you can see some of the brush marks are kind of following what I would think the pine boughs are doing, the branches of the pine trees. So let's give it some texture. And I'm also playing with some more ideas of how I would add additional shapes. So I've made this a little more complex than the initial drawing to emulate the real life complexity of the tree. So let's play with a little dark here. I'm moving some of that around. And then what I want to do now is switch to a cooler purple. So I'm mixing a little more of this ultramarine blue into the purple. So these trees are slightly further back than this foreground tree. So I want to cool off this dark a bit. The value is still dark because I'm trying to maintain that idea of the no-tone or the dark light design, but the temperature's changed. See, there's a little bit more of a slightly bluer violet color. Let's make it even bluer yet. I'm going to dip now into the cobalt blue, thin it out, keep the paint thin, so there we go, slightly bluer version, fairly dark still. With each mark along the edge of the tree, I'm trying to think of the individual variety. I'm thinking thick and thin, big, little, trying to think of variety in terms of shape and stay away from too many repetitive or similar shaped lines. lines or shapes. So at this stage, you can start to get a gist of the trees, just a suggestion of what they're like. I'm going to bring a little bit of this blue over to this tree here, just so I tie these two colors together. So you have a little bit of the blue on this side and a little bit of that on that side. Maybe a little bit of the blue here on the edges of the pines. When you're looking through the edges of pines against the sky, you'll see some atmosphere will be visible right around the edges where the tree meets the sky. So a little note of blue right in those spots really help to suggest that idea of atmosphere being caught by the pine tree shapes. Okay, let's go back to the red. I'm going to come into the foreground now with this dark shape. Again, at this time, I'm looking kind of simultaneously, probably first looking at my thumbnail sketch and then looking at the photo. So the thumbnail gives me the extreme simplicity, and the looking at the photo gives me more of the drawing that I might want to incorporate. So moving between the two is a good idea. We don't want to abandon the idea of that initial plan, because a lot of thought has gone into making that one simple and effective. But we do want to just add a little more information. And the paint is very thin. Again, it just is an opportunity to sort of start to block in the shapes. So we want to do it accurately, but just there should also be a sense that we can always go back and correct, because the paint's thin. I can wipe it out and restate it, which kind of helps to free my mind up, so I do not get too precise in the drawing. I can have fun with the mark makings and have fun with the idea of the placement of the shapes and just enjoy the process. I kind of think of it as, walking a tightrope, but knowing that there's a safety net below. So, if I fall, I'm good. I can always restate this and wipe it out, start again. Okay, I want to go back to the idea of those perspective lines we talked about in the drawing, the idea of the 1-point perspective. Just going to indicate very lightly some of the lines. This helps me to think about shapes in the future that I might add that might kind of follow the line like it does right there, it does here. These lines help to guide me towards that center of interest. So in here I have a really nice little cast shadow that I had talked about. So I want to incorporate that into the design. Okay, and then lastly, that little bit of mountain off in the distance that I wanted to add, that I saw in my hike up to this spot. I think it is a little aspect of the painting that will add another dimension of depth and visual interest. So I just want to incorporate that shape. So I mixed a little cooler bit of color using the same two colors. I've used at this point alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and now I want to add just a little bit more of that cobalt blue to that. And I can dip into the white, and the white will give me a light value, but as soon as you dip into the white using your block and brush, this brush now has to be clean, because you want your initial darks to be just pure paint and turpentine with no white paint. So be very careful of that block in, not having any white paint. So this will probably be the end of this stage of the painting now that I've added white to the brush. And I want to add just a bit more of that distant mountain, kind of peeking through some of the tree shapes here. Because occasionally you'll see it kind of peeking through areas. Just touch it pretty confidently. We want to just touch it onto the surface of the canvas and leave it. Okay, so what I'm looking for now is the space between the sky and the shape of the mountain. What size is that? And I'm seeing there is a nice little variety. The mountain shape's going to be a little smaller, so I'm giving it variety. So we're always thinking of that every step of the way. What is the variety of the shapes we're offering? So every decision is always based on a compositional thought. It's right about at this stage where it's a good idea to take a break, take a look at the shapes, step back away from the canvas, analyze what you've got on there before you proceed further. Okay, after I stepped back and took a sort of critical look at the overall shapes, there was a few shapes that I felt were just a little clunky, a little clumsy. I think it's always a good idea to, those areas that you find just aren't quite working, go back and adjust them. Now, why is that? That's the thing to ask. Like, why does a shape not feel right, or why does it feel right? It's usually the variety. If they're similar sizes, that typically lends to that idea that there needs to be some correction. And that's the first thing I do. I'll go and address those things I think are too close in size. So I'm going to come in here and carve out some of this shape. And I like to do this in the initial stages. This is foundation stuff, and it's got to feel right at this stage. Better to kind of resolve it now than to wait later. I always find it's very useful to address any areas that might be problem areas later, to address them now. It just might be a slow way to start initially, but eventually it speeds up the painting process. As we go along painting, we'll have a lot more confidence in where we're headed, and so this is such a critical stage of the painting process. Again, keep the paint thin at this stage, diluting the paint just slightly with some Turpenoid. Okay, just trying to kind of finesse the shapes a little bit. That's feeling a little better. There was an area here that almost was squared off, and it just wasn't feeling in harmony with the rest of the shapes. So I kind of made more of an organic shape, and that seems to have made it a little more visually interesting. Okay, I'm just sort of stepping back, taking a critical look at it. It helps to squint your eyes down. Squint your eyes down. Compare and contrast again. Look at the positive and negative shapes. Look at the placement of the big dark shapes. Look at the connection of shapes. Look to see if there's any similar shapes that are, things that are competing with each other. Change those, address them now, and you'll be happier as the painting goes along. Often when I step back, I look at the my first initial thumbnail sketch, and I look at what I liked that was working in that sketch, and I look at the painting at this step and see if there's areas that I've changed too much. that might not be working. I see this kind of breaks it up, so I'm going to simplify this little shape there. There we go. That's kind of makes it a bigger tree shape. So essentially, I want this to be my biggest shaped tree, and then the others are much smaller. Okay. And I'm looking at the various negative shapes to see the variety. This is a big negative shape, a medium-sized negative shape, and a couple smaller negative shapes. Initially, I thought these might be similar in size, but there is quite a nice variety. Look at the size of this negative shape and the size of this negative shape. And they're different enough that it's effective, it works. Okay, so after blocking this in and kind of looking at how I laid in the paint, there's areas where I kind of laid it in fairly thick. So knowing that that's going to take a while to dry, especially the nature of the pigments I used, what I want to do here is do a little scraping down of the paint. So it kind of allows the paint that is left to dry sooner, and I can get back to other layers of paint. So I'll just show you really quickly what I'm talking about. We're gonna just knock off some of the large area of paint. Good idea if you're anxious to get to the next stage of the painting is just to knock down some of the heavy paint. So I'm just taking the palette knife, kind of using the side of it, scraping down. You're going to end up with some ghost image of what was there, but a lot less of that texture that you'll have to deal with, and that will be a benefit for the next painting session. So there's areas that are already fairly thin, I'm okay with them, but there's areas where the paint was laid in a little thicker, and I just want to knock those down. And that's what I'm taking here. And you never know, it adds another bit of textural quality to the work. So it's kind of fun to play with this idea of just knocking off some of the paint. Again, you don't want to change the major shapes. You're just knocking off some of the heavy paint. Just scraping it down. Okay, I'm confident that will be a lot nicer surface to work on once that's dried up for a little bit. So, okay, we'll see you in the next session.